And now to our roundtable. We are joined by Colin Reed, who is the chair of the Economics and Finance Department at SUNY Plattsburgh, an author and columnist with the Press Republican here in Plattsburgh. And Jay Bryan is a business and economics columnist for the Montreal Gazette. You'll find his columns in the Saturday edition of the Gazette and online. Welcome to you both. Yeah. Let's begin with a crisis in Ukraine unfolding. We're taping midweek. The Russian forces have invaded, and aside from the history and the politics here and all that turmoil, what's the economic impact, the potential?
Probably not much. There was a big impact on world markets on Monday when the dramatic invasion of Crimea over the weekend had to be absorbed all at once. And then there was a big bounce back on Tuesday as I think people in markets sort of realized that this is a terrible, terrible thing morally and politically, but Ukraine doesn't have close enough links to the world economically or financially to have a big impact on developed economies.
And as you said, Crimea has suffered quite a loss financially in those days, but I think in the medium term, Russia is taking a hit. The rubles hit a new low, and their stock market's really had the wind taken out of it. And a lot of investors who have now been thinking of considering investing in Russia are now wondering if it's really a free market over there, or is it reverting back to its former Soviet days?
Yeah, although I'd be tempted to bet that even Russia won't take very much of a blow unless the totally unexpected happens and the leaders of the Western world stiffen their response quite a lot more than they have so far. Because Russia essentially is a huge oil exporter. The world needs oil. And certainly the very big consumers of Russian oil and gas in Western Europe are not showing any signs of saying, well, we're going to take a blow to our economy just in order to show the Russians that that they really can't behave that way.
That's right.
And Ukraine, for the past several years in the post-Soviet era, has been struggling, and it's at a point where it's looking for a savior. It's looking partially to Russia, looking to the European Union, and it's sort of there's the tug of war going on.
Emotionally, Ukraine wanted to pull closer to the West, and when I say Ukraine, I mean kind of what seems to be most Ukrainians, because there's a very large population of Russian-speaking Ukrainians in the east and south of the country who still feel powerful emotional attachments to Russia. But Ukraine really seemed to want to join the other former Soviet bloc countries like Poland that have enjoyed very substantial success as free market economies since they stopped being part of the Soviet Union. But the president of Ukraine felt the other way. He was part of the that Eastern Ukraine current of opinion that said the old ways were fine and being closely aligned with Russia was fine, and probably most important, the kind of corrupt crony capitalism that we saw in Russia for many years, still do see, was also fine, and he certainly enriched himself and his family enormously that way. And that was one of the reasons why he lost so much popularity. It wasn't just that he refused to sign an economic deal that he had been offered by the European Union and had seemed ready to accept last autumn, but also that his personal credibility was gone. He was known to be so deeply, deeply corrupt. So that's why the kind of uprising in the nation's capital succeeded, I think. But it didn't dent his legitimacy in the eyes of many people in eastern Ukraine, it seems. And of course, Russia feels very deeply threatened by the Ukraine's pulling away toward the West, and in the eyes of Mr. Putin, apparently maybe becoming a member of NATO, so that there would be a kind of a military threat, he believes, right on his doorstep.
And they talk about the economic consequences for Putin. The first step would be boycotting the G8 in Sochi coming up this summer.
Yeah.
What other steps could the U.S. do here?
Well, that's not an economic consequence, really. That's more of a prestige consequence. And that's a very serious consequence because, after all, he was willing to spend $50 billion on the most expensive Winter Olympics in world history in order to build up his prestige. So now he's thrown all of that away and a good deal more. But there are real steps that could be taken. There could be some sort of a boycott of some kinds of Russian products. But again, oil is pretty hard to boycott. And there could be restrictions on American investment or possibly European investment in Russia, although the Europeans don't seem very firm in their willingness to pay a price. They're all pro-democracy, but they're not pro-democracy enough to be willing to pay a price. So it's not clear that there will be a big economic price, apart from the one that Colin mentioned, which is a significant one. If people believe that the Soviet Union is even more of a quasi-dictatorship and even more arbitrary than Putin has already shown himself to be, if a business person is sort of, I think I'll invest in Russia, but I'm not so sure. I'm sort of on, on the edge of not knowing exactly which way to jump. This might push them to say, maybe not.
And as far as the turmoil in Ukraine, does this have an impact on emerging markets?
I don't really think so. As a matter of fact, it may even go the other way, and some of the resources that might have been normally directed to Russia as one of the significant countries in the BRIC will now go to the other emerging markets instead.
Yeah, Russia's considered to have one of the more attractive stock markets among the emerging markets, not because it's a particularly stable place that has particularly great respect for the rights of shareholders, but just because its stock market has a very low valuation that makes it likely that you'd make some money as a, in terms of capital gains over the years. But now this is being offset by a whole new level of political uncertainty.
Talking about forces to be reckoned with, this winter and the polar vortex has been a force to be reckoned with here in the U.S. Is that partly or a big part responsible for some of the signs that we're seeing, weakening signs of growth in the U.S. economy?
That's one of the two or three things, yes, because the weather very often has a significant effect on the economy. You wouldn't expect it to have as much of an effect at this time of the year when weather-sensitive areas of the economy like construction are already kind of slowing down. But this was so bad that areas like retailing were also clobbered. And on top of that, there was sort of an artificial caffeine rush in the economy late last year because manufacturers produced more stuff than they needed for a while, so there was a big buildup of inventories. Well, that's great while you're doing it, but then once you've got all that stuff and the shelves are full, you slow down in order to try and keep from having products left on your shelves for a long, long time. So that's going to impede economic growth about now, and indeed it seems to have done that. So we have a real, I think, a significant contribution of these kind of not fundamental reasons for the economy to slow down, but just kind of stuff that comes and goes and that nobody can predict.
There's also a little bit of a stagflation element too. You spoke about the stagnant economy, and whereas in the North Country, we're somewhat used to working out in the cold, but when it's 6 degrees in Atlanta, that really curbs construction quite a bit down there.
Yes.
At the same time, we have rising energy costs because of the greater demand for fuel oil, which is pretty much synonymous with diesel fuel. Diesel fuel price has been rising significantly. And the amount of demand
shooting up dramatically.
That's right. All the energy sectors are all interrelated. Even electricity, the city of Plattsburgh has just about double the bill for January electricity.
Natural gas, which has been a big bargain for a few years, not so much these last
and
few.
And also maintenance of people's furnaces and
yeah.
plumbing systems that they failed in this relatively long-term cold. So it pushed the inflation rate for the month up to about 0.4%. That's an annual rate around 4 or 5%. So that was quite an effect as well. At the same time as showing weaknesses in one sector, you have inflation overall, and that's the classic definition of a stagflation circumstance.
Yeah, except that I wouldn't expect it to last for the medium term.
I don't think so either.
Yeah,
that's right.
And Janet Yellen basically telling a Senate committee that they'll keep an eye on it, but nothing.
You know, she's always been somewhat more concerned about the unemployment rate. For instance, she was the unemployment hawk on the Federal Reserve, whereas other people were much more hawkish about concerned about the inflation rate. So I think she's just really showing her roots. As a matter of fact, she's the one that said back in 2007, 2008, she's the one that detected earliest in the Federal Reserve that there is some real softening in the economy, whereas everybody else was focusing on the rising commodity prices. She called it right, and Ben Bernanke probably called it wrong at that point.
How's she doing a month
Although he
into
came
her?
around quickly, to his credit.
Somewhat quickly.
Yeah.
How is she doing a month into her new job, or is it too early to?
She's doing fine. She hasn't said anything crazy, and she's among her colleagues in the economics profession. I mean, we all know that she doesn't come from exactly the same political place that Ben Bernanke comes from, but no big differences. Ben Bernanke was a Republican, for example, but a moderate Republican, a species that is nearly extinct. But he was one of the surviving ones, and I imagine she's a Democrat. She's a bit of a liberal, but again, a moderate one. I think he was quite worried about employment. She's probably even more worried about employment, and maybe appropriately so, because unemployment has been relatively high now for an even longer period of time than it was under Bernanke's watch. And long-term unemployment tends to turn into what economists call structural unemployment, which is to say that if somebody is unemployed for a month, well, when they get another job, you know, the skills will still be quite relevant. If they're unemployed for 5 years, their skills are possibly not going to be relevant anymore. And if they're already middle-aged when they became unemployed, it's conceivable that they'll never work again.
And you're talking about politics. Let's talk politics north of the border. This week, the premier calling an election for a month from today, the 7th of April. Believes her party has the majority, or polling gives them a good feeling.
Yes, to the extent that pollsters are right about these things, and they tend to be right probably more often than wrong. So there's a good chance that she will form a majority government. That's, I think, very bad news, not just because I'm a Federalist and she's a secessionist, but because she has proven to be economically inept, both as finance minister and as in terms of the finance minister she chose as premier. That hasn't hurt her in Quebec, because in Quebec she managed to turn the attention to these very ugly kind of identity issues in which she portrays Quebec as being threatened by outside influences. And this time it's outside religious influences, which, you know, anybody who's lived in Quebec for a while knows that she's talking about, you know, people worried about seeing a woman in a headscarf on the street or that sort of thing. Nobody's worried about seeing a crucifix in a province that's been Catholic for centuries. And so there's this charter of values that she wants to push through that would make it illegal to wear certain kinds of religious garb if you're in a government position. It's a solution for which there is no known problem, but it has successfully whipped up enough fear among the Francophone electorate, which is of course 4/5 of the whole electorate, that she's likely to win you know, on this platform, being a defender of the French population in Quebec. The downside is that she's likely to call a referendum if she has a majority government, and she thinks she has any chance at all of winning it. And of course, in Quebec, a referendum isn't really a referendum, which means a vote that has some real legal consequence, because Quebec doesn't have the legal right to declare itself another different independent country. It's a plebiscite on secession, and so even if she wins a yes, it won't settle the question. It'll just create a whole new level of panic and uncertainty. And this is reflected in a very large poll just done by the CBC, showing that 50% of the non-Francophones in Quebec, the Anglos and the so-called allophones, you know, people who speak, you know, Greek or Italian or Chinese or whatever at home, 50% of those people have thought seriously about moving out of Quebec in the past year. That's not to say the 50% will move out, or even a big chunk of them, because it's very hard to move, but it does show the level of terrible anxiety and frankly despair. They don't seem to see that there's any political hope for them, so they just want to leave.
There are the language laws that they contend with.
That's right, but people have gotten used to the idea that French is the dominant language in Quebec, and if you want to live in Quebec, you'd better have enough French to get by filling out a government form, if you're a business person, for example, or, you know, dealing with people on the street, or dealing with people in business. And virtually everybody can do that. In the high 90% range of Quebecers who can manage in French. So it has nothing to do with French anymore. It has to do with, I think, a big chunk of the population, nearly a fifth of the population, who I think just feel as if they're not only not respected by the government, but the government actually treats them as if they're kind of the enemy. And that's very, very demoralizing after a few years.
I remember when Pauline Marois ran 2 years ago, we had talked about whether ultimately she would be looking for another referendum on separating from the rest of Canada. So if they win the majority in this case, how soon do you think they'll move ahead with a referendum push?
I don't think they know how soon they'll move ahead because they have to have what they call winning conditions, which kind of makes clear what the idea is. The idea is not to find out what the population thinks. The idea is to create an atmosphere in which the population will think what they want them to think and will vote yes. And you know, if there's enough worry about those people wearing headscarves or any other symbol of any religion other than Catholicism, conceivably it could be early in the mandate.
And it has to be timed very carefully, as we've seen in the past. They have to, it's almost like running a campaign with that as the goal. And of course, other times they've had the referendum past few decades, it's been close.
Well, it was close the second time. It wasn't very close the first time. It was about 2/3 against, but the second time it was extremely close because they had a brilliantly charismatic spokesperson who they brought in to replace the unfortunate Jacques Parizeau, who was running them into a disaster of unpopularity. Marois is not a brilliantly charismatic politician, and she is not a terribly competent administrator, it seems. Her government hasn't done anything of note that I can think of. She's been a little more business friendly than most PQ governments, which gives her some credit. So she doesn't look as ideologically driven as some past PQ governments. But I would guess she would want to do this fairly early in the campaign, simply so she wouldn't have time enough to make enough mistakes to become unpopular. The likelihood is, as her mandate goes on, she's not likely to increase in popularity. You can't keep finding issues to whip up public opinion, because even though the Francophones of Quebec are very deeply concerned, understandably, about their identity and their language and the security of their language, they're not stupid. And so having one campaign of fear, okay, that's working quite well for her. Another one right afterwards, I wouldn't think that would work nearly as well.
It was just a couple, 2-3 years ago, though, when we talked with you, that the polls showed maybe 30% support for a referendum. Has that changed to the point now where you think there would be enough support for one?
I don't think there would be enough support for one, but I'm sure the support has gone up, because in a political atmosphere in which people are very worried about their identity, then they're more willing to consider a radical move to do something that they hope would help to defend their identity, which would be for Quebec to become an independent nation that would have all the power of an independent nation to, I don't know what they would ban or what they would encourage, but apparently many people believe that as an independent nation, Quebec might have powers that would somehow magically protect it against the global dominance of English as the language of business and trade.
On this side of the border, for most elections now, the economy and jobs are the driving factors. How concerned are folks in Quebec, and how much of a factor do you think that would be in the election?
That's the amazing thing. Job creation in Quebec has been quite poor in recent years, and I can't blame it all on the PQ, because it has been somewhat poor under the Liberals too. But I would expect that to be another pressure point that Madame Marois has to worry about, which is that her government's economic performance, her government's job creation performance, to the extent that governments can create conditions for job creation, have not been wonderful. They haven't been terrible, because the government is spending billions of dollars a year on a massive public works projects, set of public work projects, mainly roads and bridges and so forth. And that does create jobs, and that does pump money into the economy, but you can only have debt-fueled growth for so long, especially in a province that has the highest debt rate in the country. But, when I say you can only do it for so long, I remember saying exactly the same thing a couple decades ago, so I guess you can do it for longer than I thought.
And we've had a year now of the Charbonneau Commission hearings.
Corruption, yes.
The corruption, has that had an impact, or has that stuck with
I think that
voters?
did have an impact, and I think that had a bad impact on the Liberal Party, because the Liberal Party is the party that is sort of associated with that kind of backdoor dirty dealings with shady construction companies and shady government suppliers. Traditionally, the PQ has portrayed itself as the party of clean politics, and I'm not so sure that that's as true now as it was in its early days. In fact, I'm pretty sure it's not. But they still have something of a halo effect of being the party that brought in election funding rules that cleaned up some of that stuff.
The federal election is about a year and a half away, the fall of 2015, but we're already seeing things are heating up. The Tories are going after the Liberals, and they're young, charismatic leader?
Justin Trudeau, yeah, he's only been in power for, I guess, about a year, and the Trudeau name, I suspect, still has significant magic among Liberals. An awful lot of Liberals who called themselves Liberals but weren't voting Liberal in the last election or two now seem to be flooding back to support the Liberals. Trudeau, by some polls, has more support across the country than Prime Minister Harper. The Tories are beginning to show a little bit of panic over that. They've been trying to tarnish Trudeau's image by saying that he's not ready for power. You know, he's not up to it, which should be a weak point for him because he is indeed inexperienced as a political leader. It seems to be bouncing off, and I suspect it might be for the reason that someone once told me elections were won or lost, which is that the challenger rarely wins an election. What happens is the incumbent loses the election. And Prime Minister Harper has run a government that's used the politics of negative attacks and fear campaigns against their opponents for years now. And it's coming home to roost, especially since there's a little whiff of corruption about around the Conservatives now. There was a big scandal over Conservative senators, even though I think some Liberal senators that probably aren't any cleaner. But there's just people don't really like Harper very much. They realize that he's a very smart guy, he's a very competent guy, and they give him, I think, credit for that. But it's hard to keep on voting for somebody you just don't like, who's using wedge issues to divide Canadians.
On this side of the border, Governor Andrew Cuomo is up for re-election. His plan, his agenda, legislative agenda for going into this election year, is a tax relief plan that includes tax breaks for manufacturers upstate, but also a tax freeze for property owners. And of course, New York pays some of the highest property taxes in the nation. So he is pushing this and wants the legislature to approve this. Some lawmakers, though, are questioning whether it's really making communities and school districts jump through too many hoops to qualify for these tax breaks.
Right, he's amazing at his ability to get the voters, the electorate, to carry some of his political water for him on this one. It's quite cleverly crafted. If a community, if a county can, for instance, hold their own on spending and promise to do so, then the state will chip in with a little bit of a minor tax rebate for the individual taxpayers.
About $200 for the average taxpayer upstate.
So it now applies pressure from the taxpayer base upwards towards the representatives to be a little bit more fiscally responsible. And one of the difficult things, though, is if you've already run your jurisdiction with a lot of fiscal responsibility and made the cuts up to now, and you're reaching that diminishing marginal returns of where you're going to cut next, you're somewhat penalized, and you don't have an awful lot of waste to trim out of your budget like another less responsible community might be able to do. So there's a little bit of pushbacks from the various legislatures.
And in order to qualify, the communities not only have to meet the tax cap, but then have to look for ways to shared services to save money. Right. And for a number of communities upstate, that might be a struggle to find here in the North Country to find that. Or do you think there are areas that towns can still find ways to share services and cut cost?
Well, New York is notorious for being the state with one of the highest numbers of different taxing jurisdictions per capita in the country.
10,500, I think, maybe the number that Governor Cuomo throws out.
That's right. And I don't think it's the highest in the country, but it's pretty near to the highest. And if we could just trim a little bit through consolidation services is the buzz line. As an example, we know that we have as many school jurisdictions in counties in New York State as many large metropolis areas do elsewhere in the country. Here we call a school superintendent, that's really another name for principal, but with a school superintendent salary and that sort of thing. So those kinds of resolving of tax jurisdictions or getting to adjoining municipalities to somehow work together to share assessors, et cetera, there probably is some more room. After all, our taxes, property taxes on a per capita basis are about the highest in the country. So there's got to be some way to figure this out. But it's that typical Albany versus local jurisdiction dance that I think we're going to have to experience for a while.
A new program is kicking off here in New York, and I'll ask if Quebec may have something similar, or Canada. It's a 6-year high school. They're called Pathways to Technology, through technology. It's basically P-Tech for short, P-Tech schools. First one, IBM funded down in New York City about 3 years ago. The first one is coming to the North Country. Students have a heavy emphasis of STEM, science, technology, engineering, math, hands-on classroom experience along with their regular studies. Then they go to community college for 2 years, all paid for. So a 6-year program, they come out with an associate's degree, pretty much with a promised job from manufacturers and other companies that are taking part in the program. And is this the wave of the future for education for a number of schools and communities and students from this point forward?
I hope so. It's maybe also a wave for the future here, but of course in some of the European countries they've been doing this all along, that you are streamed into some sort of an advanced manufacturing kind of apprenticeship program sponsored by both a corporation and perhaps a union, and at the end of this advanced training you end up with a job. So I think this is a very positive step, and it also forges a good opportunity to form partnerships between management, and maybe even some of the unions can get involved in this and really take part in nurturing that young workforce.
It seems to take it a step further. There are a number of mentoring programs now, job shadowing, internships that already exist, but it seems to take it that step further, that from 9th grade on, you are immersed in high tech, and that you're prepared for these jobs, and the employers get somebody who already basically has 6 years of training coming out to work for them.
That's right. It's very cohesive. It's a program rather than an isolated patchwork of different things that hopefully comes together and are all aligned.
Relatively new concept here in the States. Is anything like that going on in Canada?
Elements of this sound familiar to me as a Quebecer. Of course, Canada, the provinces each have the right to design their own educational programs basically from the ground up, so there's a lot of variation. But Quebec was a very early adopter of the system where virtually everybody is streamed into a 2-year college at the end of high school, and the 2-year colleges are virtually free. They were free for a while, and now they're still very, very cheap, so that you can create a program in which you begin to concentrate in science and math in high school and continue in your CEGEP or junior college to do the same thing. But it's not a completely integrated program where you know from the beginning to the end where you're going to go, and especially you don't have that final part of the puzzle, which is absolutely crucial, I think, which is the link to an employer. There are universities like Concordia that have extensive co-op programs, and those are very, very good. But I don't think we have anything that's quite as good in terms of letting a kid who's willing to make a decision very early on in the school career, which has cost of its own, jump into something that effectively guarantees a kind of a high-tech job at the end. That sounds pretty good.
We are expecting that President Obama is going to make a decision on the Keystone XL pipeline. I think it's Canada's natural resources minister is suggesting that may come sooner rather than later. A lot of people thinking maybe the president would put it off until after the midterm elections. So that decision is going to be coming. I guess the question is, even if President Obama approves the construction to move ahead, how quickly that's going to happen, because obviously within his own party there are a number of opponents to this. But the development of that pipeline, how critical is that to Canada to get that oil from the tar sands of Alberta in that pipeline to the Gulf Coast?
Pretty important, because although Canada does have other ways of getting the oil out, and it will use those other ways, one of the obvious ones would being rail transport, where the same oil could go to exactly the same place, only with a significantly higher risk of a collision and an explosion and a fire along the way, because railways just can't move flammable products like petroleum as safely and cheaply as a pipeline can. But Canada could build a pipeline to the West Coast and send that oil to China, for example, and of course use the rail to send it to American refineries. But I think another thing would be that it's going to be a real test of the relationship between Canada and the United States. There are a lot of people in Canada who, like me, have serious reservations about the development of the tar sands, because it hasn't been done with nearly enough concern to minimize the carbon impacts and minimize the environmental impacts, and maybe get slowed down so that can be done more effectively. But it's not really up to another country to tell Canada how it ought to develop its resources. And I feel uncomfortable saying that about a resource like this that's kind of dirty. But nevertheless, I think it's a kind of fundamental truth. And you can just imagine how Americans would feel if Canada or Mexico said that, no, you can't link up a pipeline that is in every respect legal and that conforms to whatever safety standards that you want to enforce, just because it's unpopular with a segment of our population. That would be an issue that would tend to poison relations for quite a while, and I think it might do that in this case too.
And you talk about the transport of the oil from the tar sands by rail. We're already seeing oil from North Dakota coming by rail across Canada,
Yes.
Canadian Pacific, now coming down across the border along Lake Champlain, and we're hearing more and more from politicians, community leaders, first responders who are concerned about the increase in the volume of oil that's now coming across the border and along Lake Champlain.
In some respects, the Bakken oil, which is much lighter oil, perhaps even more dangerous, because there was an issue recently where there was a fire because that oil can ignite quite easily.
And the
And we
Bakken
saw what
oil.
happened to Lac Mega Antique, for that matter.
Yes.
And a lot of these transportation networks were designed predating some of the towns. So we have railroads going right through towns, right
yes.
through upstate New York.
It seems as if the railroads are responding to insisting or trying to pressure the shippers to use the safer
Yes.
tanker cars, not the old DOT 111s, but a new generation. In fact, the mayor in Plattsburgh says that as far as they can tell, the majority of tanker cars on the CP trains going through Plattsburgh are using the newer, stronger tanker cars.
Yeah, the new CEO of CP has been very, I thought, courageous about being kind of loud and public in exhorting oil shippers to use the better rail cars, because the better rail cars are actually only, as you said, safer. They're not safe. The old ones were really terrible. The old ones were built, I guess, on the assumption that nothing would ever go wrong because they're kind of thin-skinned, and if anything does go wrong, boy, they leak and they explode. The new ones are better, but I don't know how much better, really.
And the railroads are trying to get the shippers to use them by charging them more if they're using the older cars to move the crude. Interesting, the Port of Albany has really become ground zero for both oil now coming from North Dakota, but also talk of a rail bringing in oil from the tar sands as well, bringing in that heavier crude. They want to be able to heat that crude in the tanks there to keep it warm, and so that looks to become a shipping point for both oils from North Dakota and from the tar sand.
And we move a fair amount of oil through the North Country, surprisingly enough. You know, not more than 1 million barrels a day, somewhat less than that, but a sizable amount, and perhaps more in the future.
And still talk of possibly reversing the pipeline from Montreal to Portland, Maine, to send the tar sands crude oil, the heavy crude, that way back to Maine and to freighters waiting their tankers to take to refineries.
You're going to offend a lot of deeply sensitive Canadian oil men who will probably cry themselves to sleep if they hear that you've been calling it tar sands. The politically correct term in Alberta these days is oil sands.
Okay. All right. Fair enough. And we want to thank Colin and Jay, and thank you for watching. That is our business edition for this month. For all of us here at Mountain Lake PBS, I'm Tom Halleck. Thanks for watching.